The 13th century was the age of the Mongols. From the steppes of Central Asia, they built the largest empire the world had ever seen. Stretching from China all the way to Europe, city after city fell. Kingdom after kingdom was forced to kneel. No one seemed able to resist. And yet, across the sea, there was one nation that refused to bow: Japan. After conquering China and Korea, Kublai Khan turned his eyes east. He sent envoys demanding submission, but Japan gave no reply. Silence was their answer, and silence was an insult the great Khan would not forgive. When the Mongol fleet finally set sail in 1274, it carried nearly 20,000 soldiers. Waiting for them on a small island were only 80 samurai. It was a battle that should never have been remembered. It was too one-sided, too hopeless. So how is it possible that this handful of warriors entered legend against the greatest military power in the world? Today, we're talking about the most impossible battle in history. In the middle of the 13th century, the Mongol Empire stood at the height of its power. What had begun as a confederation of nomadic tribes on the Eurasian steppe had expanded into the largest land empire the world had ever seen. From the plains of Hungary in the west to the shores of Korea in the east, Mongol horsemen had crushed kingdom after kingdom. The empire of Genghis Khan and his descendants was more than a military machine. It was also a network of conquered people, trade routes and tribute systems that connected almost the entire continent. Few nations could ever dream of resisting such power, and those that tried usually paid a terrible price. In 1260, a new leader rose to the top of this vast empire. His name was Kublai Khan, grandson of Genghis Khan. Kublai was not content to simply rule as a nomadic warlord. He wanted to build a dynasty that would last, one that would combine Mongol military strength with the traditions of Chinese statecraft. In 1264, he moved the capital to Khanbalik, the city that would later become Beijing. In 1271, he officially declared the founding of the Yuan dynasty, claiming the mandate of heaven as Emperor of China. By securing northern China, Kublai gained access to enormous resources. He controlled fertile lands, vast populations, and shipbuilding centres along the eastern coast. He also held the Yellow River Basin, the economic heart of the region. But he knew that to keep his dynasty strong, he needed to look beyond China's borders. To the east lay the Korean kingdom of Goryeo. The Mongols launched multiple invasions of Korea between 1231 and 1259, and after years of resistance, the Koreans finally surrendered. Goryeo became a vassal state, forced to supply soldiers, materials, and most importantly, ships for future campaigns. Korea was transformed into a staging ground for Mongol naval power. With Korea under his control, Kublai now had a springboard for crossing the sea to his next target: Japan. Why Japan? There were several reasons, each one adding to the others. The first was geography. At its closest point, Japan lies less than 200 kilometers from the Korean coast. To an empire that had already conquered distant lands, that short distance made Japan look dangerously close. If left independent, Japan could become a problem, or even a safe harbour for the enemies of the Yuan dynasty. If conquered, it could secure Mongol dominance over the entire Western Pacific. The second reason was wealth and resources. Japan was not known for great cities or vast armies, but it did have something the Mongols needed: sulphur. As a volcanic land, Japan had large supplies of sulphur, a key ingredient in making gunpowder. At this time, the Mongols were using new weapons such as iron and ceramic bombs filled with explosive power. Securing Japan's sulphur would strengthen their armies and weaken their rivals, especially the southern Song dynasty in China, which was still resisting Mongol conquest and relied on Japanese trade. Beyond sulphur, there was also rumours of gold and silver on the islands. Medieval travellers often described Japan, or Zipangyu, as a land overflowing with riches. For Kublai, struggling with inflation caused by paper currency in China, these resources sounded especially tempting. The third reason was prestige. By the 1270s, Kublai ruled one of the largest empires in history, but he was never satisfied. He wanted to show the world that his power extended even across the seas. Conquering Japan would be a symbolic victory, proving that no nation, no matter how distant, could defy the Mongol Empire. Japan was also one of the last major states in East Asia that remained fully independent. To Kublai, allowing it to stand apart was an insult to his authority. At first, Kublai tried diplomacy. Between 1266 and 1273, he sent multiple envoys to Japan with letters demanding submission and tribute. These messages spoke of the Mongols as the rulers of the world and urged Japan to join their system of tribute and peace. But in Kamakura, the leaders of the shogunate gave no reply. The missions were stalled, ignored, or dismissed. Some envoys were even treated with open disrespect. To the Mongols, this silence was an insult. In the eyes of Kublai, Japan was daring to mock the empire that all others feared. And so, after years of unanswered letters, the decision was clear. If words could not break Japan, then Kublai would send ships and fire. While Kublai Khan was building fleets and armies, Japan looked very different. The emperor still sat on the throne in Kyoto, but his role was mostly ceremonial. Real power rested with the Kamakura shogunate, a military government founded at the end of the 12th century. By the 1270s, this shogunate was controlled by the Hojo clan, and the regent at the time was Hojo Tokumuni. Tokumuni was young, but he carried the heavy responsibility of defending Japan against the greatest empire on earth. Politically, the shogunate was stable and firm, yet its military system was decentralized and relied heavily on local warriors. At the heart of Japanese society stood the samurai. More than soldiers, they were bound by a strict code of values, later known as Bushido. To them, honor, loyalty, and duty were worth more than life itself. A samurai was expected to serve his lord without hesitation, and to die with dignity rather than live in shame. This spirit shaped the way Japan prepared for war. It meant that even a small group of warriors could be trusted to fight to the very end, but it also meant that they sometimes valued personal bravery over coordinated strategy. Unlike the Mongols, who could field massive professional armies, Japan had no standing national force. Instead, defense depended on the gokenin, local samurai who served the shogunate when called upon. Each clan was responsible for raising its own fighters from its lands and villages. In times of peace, these men lived as landowners or farmers, but in times of war, they were expected to take up arms. This system worked well for small-scale conflicts inside Japan, but it was not designed to face a large foreign invasion. When the news of the Mongols' demands reached Kamakura, Tokumuni understood the danger. Japan had little experience with wars against outside powers, but it could not ignore the threat. Preparations began across Kyushu, the southern island closest to Korea and the most likely invasion point. Temples and shrines were ordered to pray for divine protection, while coastal villages were told to remain watchful. Patrol boats were ready, and small fortifications were reinforced. Still, the numbers were painfully small. Historians estimate that Japan could muster only around 4,000 to 6,000 warriors in total. Against an enemy that could deploy tens of thousands, this was a frightening disadvantage. The Japanese hoped that unity, spirit, and their code of honor would make up for what they lacked in manpower. But in the Mongol court, Kublai Khan's commanders believed that Japan's scattered system could not withstand the storm of invasion, and it was on a small island in the middle of the sea that the first strike would fall. In early November 1274, the Mongol fleet finally set sail from the Korean coast. Around 900 ships carried close to 30,000 men, a mixture of Mongol cavalry, Chinese soldiers, and Korean conscripts. It was one of the largest naval expeditions East Asia had ever seen up to that time. Their destination was the Japanese islands, and the first step on that path was Tsushima, a small rugged island halfway between Korea and Kyushu. For the Mongols, it was a convenient landing point. For Japan, it was the first line of defense. Tsushima had no great fortresses, no stone walls, and no reinforcements on the way. The island's entire defense rested in the hands of Sō Sukekuni, the local governor, who could muster only around 80 mounted samurai and a few retainers. These men were loyal and well trained, but they faced an army that outnumbered them by hundreds to one. Still, by the code of Bushido, retreat was not an option. Sukekuni and his men prepared to meet the fleet head-on, knowing that help from the mainland could never arrive in time. On November 4th, Mongol ships appeared off the coast of Tsushima. The landing point was Komoda Beach, a flat stretch of sand on the island's western side. Before dawn, wave after wave of troops began to disembark. Archers, infantry, and cavalry poured onto the shore in a coordinated and disciplined landing. The Japanese attempted to negotiate, as was customary, but the Mongols answered with arrows, forcing the defenders to mount their horses and charge. The samurai entered the battle in a way they had always known. Warriors rode forward one by one, announcing their names and lineages, challenging their enemies to individual duels. For centuries, this style of combat had defined Japanese warfare, where personal honor and reputation mattered as much as victory itself. Swords clashed, arrows were loosed, and a handful of samurai even managed to cut down multiple foes. One warrior, according to Japanese accounts, killed 25 enemies before he fell. But the Mongols did not fight by these rules. Their armies advanced in massed formation, shield walls protecting their infantry as coordinated volleys of arrows rained down on the defenders. Drums signalled movements, and each unit supported the other. To the samurai, who expected personal combat, this was an alien and terrifying style of battle. Even more shocking was the use of new weapons Japan had never seen before. Explosive bombs filled with gunpowder. These iron and ceramic grenades were hurled by hand or launched from simple catapults, bursting with smoke, fire, and thunderous noise. Horses panicked at the blasts, and warriors were blinded and deafened. For the first time in Japanese history, gunpowder had arrived on the battlefield. Others were overwhelmed. The samurai charged repeatedly into the Mongol lines, but each time they were surrounded by sheer numbers and pushed back. By nightfall, nearly all of the Japanese warriors, including Sō Sukekuni himself, had been killed. Tsushima's thin line of resistance had been broken. The clash at Komoda beach was short, but it was unlike anything Japan had ever faced before. It was not only a defeat in numbers, but a shock that revealed how unprepared the Japanese system was against the methods of the great Khan's empire. The battle was bloody and short, but what happened after the fall of the island was even more terrifying. When the fighting at Komoda beach ended, almost all of Tsushima's defenders lay dead. The Mongols had crushed the small band of samurai and their followers, but their campaign on the island was not finished. With no resistance left, they moved through the settlements methodically. Villages were looted, houses were burned, and temples were torn down. Tsushima, which had been the first shield of Japan, now became a warning to the entire nation. The brutality was not limited to the warriors. Ordinary people, farmers, fishermen, and townsfolk suffered the worst. Civilians who could not escape were cut down on the streets. Women and children were killed without mercy, and local chronicles record acts of deliberate cruelty. Some women were tied with ropes threaded through their hands and dragged until they collapsed. Others were thrown into the sea to drown. Infants were not spared. These actions were not just the result of rage, they were meant to send a clear message. This is the fate of those who resist the Mongol Empire. After a few days, the Mongol commanders had achieved their goal in Tsushima. The island was destroyed, its people either dead or scattered. With their rear secure, the fleet prepared to continue the invasion. The next target was Iki Island, another small but strategic point lying between Tsushima and Kyushu. Like Tsushima, Iki had little in the way of defences, and the one-sided fight, horrific aftermath, was soon to repeat. Again, the local governor, Taira no Gagataka, called upon the samurai of his domain and their retinues to resist the invading forces. He met them with 100 samurai before falling back to the island's fortress, Hinotsuni Castle, at nightfall. The next day he led a final desperate attack with the survivors before committing suicide with his family. Iki was ravaged as Tsushima before it, and again the fate of the population was meant to break future Japanese resistance. Japanese sources describe captured women being stripped naked, pierced through the hands and tied to the keels of the Mongol ships when they left Iki and continued on toward the mainland. The devastation shocked Japan. Survivors who managed to flee Kyushu told stories that spread quickly through the towns and villages. Families remembered loved ones who never returned, and priests described the dead in terms of sacrifice. Folklore soon grew around the tragedy. Burial mounds were raised for the countless bodies, later known as senzuka, or the Mounds of 1,000 Souls. Songs of farewell were said to have been sung by the women of Tsushima before their deaths, a detail that echoed in later legend. Parents warned children for generations with the phrase, "The Mongols are coming," a phrase that carried both fear and memory of the massacre. The loss of Tsushima in Iki carried a deeper meaning than the fall of some small island. It revealed the Mongols' method of warfare. They did not only seek to defeat armies in the field, they also aimed to break morale by showing that resistance meant destruction for fighters and civilians alike. In this way, Tsushima and Iki became a bloody message to the Kamakura shogunate. Submission was the only path to survival. Japan now understood that the invaders were not coming to negotiate terms or establish limited control. They were coming to destroy. And yet, at Hakata Bay, the Mongols would find that Japan was no longer as unprepared as they believed. The Mongols landed in disciplined formations, their ranks moving forward under the sound of drums that echoed across the shoreline. Every movement was coordinated, from the archers who unleashed volleys of arrows to the infantry who advanced in tight lines behind shields. Their cavalry, once on solid ground, was ready to sweep around the flanks. This was the method of steppe warfare adapted to coastal battle, and it was unlike anything the Japanese had ever faced before. The samurai answered in their own traditional style. Individual warriors rode out to challenge the enemy, shouting their names and ancestry before loosing arrows or charging with sword in hand. To them, this was not only battle, but also a way to prove personal honor. Lacking the trained coordination of their enemies, small groups fought fiercely. Some cut down several foes before being overwhelmed. But against the Mongol system of collective fighting, these acts of courage made little difference. Coordinated volleys rained down on the Japanese lines, and every samurai who rode forward found himself facing dozens of enemies at once. What shocked the defenders even more was the return of the new weapon first seen on Tsushima: gunpowder bombs. Mongol and Chinese soldiers hurled iron and ceramic explosives that burst with deafening noise and clouds of smoke. Horses panicked, throwing their riders. Men were blinded or burned, and formations broke apart in confusion. Contemporary Japanese sources describe the fear and disbelief as these strange weapons exploded among them. For an army raised on swords, bows, and spears, the thunder of gunpowder was terrifying and difficult to resist. Losses on the Japanese side mounted quickly. The Mongols pressed inland from the shore, burning villages and temples as they advanced. The defenders struggled to slow them, retreating step by step while trying to regroup. But the Japanese were not without answers. At nightfall, when the invaders pulled back to their ships to rest, local warriors launched daring raids. Using small boats, they rowed silently out to the anchored Mongol fleet and boarded vessels in sudden surprise attack. Fires were set, guards were killed, and chaos spread through the anchored ships before the raiders slipped back into the dark. These night assaults did not destroy the fleet, but they unsettled the invaders, showing that Japan would not collapse as easily as Tsushima had. For the Mongols, Hakata Bay was proving to be more difficult than expected. They had the numbers, the weapons, and the momentum, but their enemy refused to flee. Every day the samurai returned to fight, and every night they struck from the shadows. After a day of brutal fighting on the beaches of Hakata, the Mongol forces withdrew to their ships as night fell. They had pushed the defenders back, inflicted heavy losses, and burned villages along the coast, yet they had not been able to establish a firm camp on Japanese soil. The local samurai had resisted fiercely during the day and then harassed them again at night with daring raids. And while the Mongol commanders became increasingly worried about their supply lines, mounting casualties and protecting ships, Japanese warriors from more and more clans kept arriving and reinforcing fortifications around Hakata, preparing for a protracted defensive fight. The Mongol commanders deliberated, some wanting to keep full pressure on the Japanese, others worrying their troops were too exhausted and their position too vulnerable. It was decided that they should withdraw to the islands they controlled and await supplies and reinforcements in safety. The Mongol warriors were recalled to their ships and prepared to withdraw, but the Sea of Japan would offer them no refuge. The invasion fleet, which numbered around 900 vessels, was anchored close to shore. These ships had been built in a hurry in Korean shipyards and varied in size and quality. Some were strong, seagoing transports, but many were flat-bottomed river craft that were not well suited to open water. Packed with soldiers, horses and supplies, they were already difficult to manage. Late that night, strong winds began to rise. The waves grew larger, and by the early hours a violent storm had formed. Japanese chronicles describe the sea churning and ships smashing against one another in the darkness. Anchors dragged along the seabed and vessels crashed into the rocky shoreline. The Mongol soldiers, most of whom were not experienced sailors, panicked as water flooded the decks. Horses broke free in terror, adding to the chaos. It is not known if the Mongol fleet was already at sea when it encountered the brunt of the storm, or if they were still moored at Hakata, but Japanese chronicles describe the wreckage washing ashore and the capture and execution of some 50 enemy soldiers found stranded on the beaches. The storm changed everything. What was hoped to be an orderly strategic withdrawal turned into an inglorious end to the campaign. The invasion force limped back to Korea, missing nearly half of its original 30,000 number. To the defenders watching from land, the sight was astonishing. The same enemy that had seemed unstoppable just a day earlier had completely disappeared overnight. Samurai and villagers saw the wreckage wash up along the coast. Across Japan there was celebration. It seemed as though prayers to heaven had been answered and faith in the shogunate, in Zen Buddhism, and most of all in the strength of the samurai martial code increased. Japan had faced the most powerful empire in the world, and with the help of heaven itself, it had survived. The Yuan court in China reported the expedition as a campaign that had inflicted damage on Japan, but the truth was clear. The invasion had ended in failure. The losses in men, horses and ships were immense, and the psychological impact was even greater. The reputation of Mongol invincibility had been cracked by scattered clan warriors and a storm. Yet both sides understood this was not the end. The Japanese knew the invasion had not been defeated by their strength alone, but by the storm. They began to prepare more seriously, building fortifications along the coast and training their forces for the possibility of another attack. The Mongols, meanwhile, could not accept such a setback. Kublai Khan had invested too much prestige and too many resources to let Japan stand free. Japan had survived the first wave. However, Kublai Khan had yet to unleash the full might of his empire. The next invasion would not see tens, but hundreds of thousands of warriors descend on Japan. But that is a story for another time. For Japan, the story of those 80 warriors who stood on the beaches of Tsushima against impossible odds became more than history. It became legend. The fall of Tsushima showed the nation what it meant to live and die by Bushido, the code of loyalty, honor, and sacrifice. The image of 80 men charging into 20,000 enemies burned itself into the Japanese collective memory, shaping how generations would understand courage. But what do you think? Was it an act of pure patriotism, or a hopeless act of madness? Tell us in the comments and subscribe for more epic stories from history. See you in the next one.